The Roman Empire. At its peak, it was one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. It seemed unbeatable. It built a complex state that ruled from Egypt to Spain, from England to modern-day Iraq. It looked like it would last forever, and today, it's a distant memory. So, why did the Roman Empire fall? Did a powerful enemy finally crush it? Was it undone by internal conflict? Or did it just stretch itself too thin? The truth is, it wasn't just one thing. The empire's downfall was a slow burn, happening over hundreds of years. To really get it, we need to go back to how it became an empire in the first place. Because originally, Rome was a republic, much smaller than the sprawling empire it would become. The republic had replaced a flawed monarchy, but the people were craving a more unified government. And one man was more than ready to answer that call: Julius Caesar. In the mid-1st century BCE, Caesar was appointed perpetual dictator of Rome. He started consolidating power, proving to be a popular and effective ruler who won many military campaigns. But his rivals saw the writing on the wall. He had no intention of ever giving up his power. So, the elites of Rome assassinated him, and in doing so, they plunged the Republic into one of the biggest political crises in its history. Civil wars erupted as powerful figures vied for control. In the end, it was Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, who came out on top. He continued his father's legacy, conquering nearby territories, including Egypt, and ending its Hellenistic era. Soon, he was even more powerful than Caesar had ever been. The Roman Senate, seeing which way the wind was blowing, granted him the title of Augustus and allowed him to rule for life. Suddenly, no one dared challenge him. The very plotters who feared Caesar's dictatorship had accidentally paved the way for Rome's first emperor, and he wouldn't be the last. From that point on, Rome became a monarchy ruled by a series of hereditary leaders, some good, some very, very bad. It developed an insatiable hunger for conquest, swallowing up a huge part of Europe and chunks of Asia and Africa. Italy remained the heart of the empire, but the new territories were organized into provinces. Each was run by a local governor, and their leadership styles could be drastically different. The empire grew so vast that it was impossible for one leader to control every single territory directly. This meant provinces had a fair bit of autonomy, as long as they paid their taxes and didn't cause any trouble. And for a while, the system seemed to work beautifully. The next two centuries were so stable, they became known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. But beneath this calm surface, trouble was brewing. During the 1st century CE, religious conflict began to simmer. The Roman Empire worshipped its traditional pantheon of gods, led by Jupiter, which was heavily tied to the Greek pantheon. This polytheistic faith was all about ornate temples and wild stories that made the gods seem surprisingly petty and human. And then came Christianity. This new faith, spinning out of the teachings of a Jewish rabbi named Jesus and his crucifixion by Roman authorities, was a stark contrast. It was an Abrahamic faith growing from the often persecuted religion of Judaism, and it received much of the same treatment in its early days. While some of the more dramatic stories, like Christians being fed to lions, are likely myths, the Roman Empire definitely saw new faiths as a threat to the established order. But as history has shown, religions are not easy to kill. For a while, the conflict stayed under the radar. Christianity was a small, fringe faith. A wise emperor would have focused on maintaining stability rather than persecuting a minority. But when you have a monarchy, you're at the mercy of genetics and the lottery of birth. And in the year 177, Rome's luck ran out. The new emperor, Commodus, would become infamous. At just 15, he was the youngest emperor ever, and his rule was dictated by his teenage emotions, leading to incredible recklessness. Imagine giving a teenager that much power. What could possibly go wrong? Because he inherited such a massive, well-oiled empire, it was hard for him to screw things up on a grand scale. But back in Rome, he wasted no time throwing things into chaos. He was known for his fickle, dictatorial leadership and his obsession with gladiator matches. He even participated in the duels himself, which basically meant his opponents were expected to lose and probably die quietly. He built a cult of personality around himself. and his reign was so chaotic that he was later immortalized as the villain in the movie Gladiator. His reign ended just as it began, with chaos. After 15 years in charge, Commodus was assassinated by a wrestler in the Roman baths, and things only got more chaotic from there. The Senate declared him a public enemy and tore down his statues. What followed became known as the Year of the Five Emperors. It was 193 CE and civil war was back. The next emperor was assassinated only 3 months into his rule. His successor essentially bribed the guards to become emperor, and he was ousted and executed just weeks later. The chaos only settled when two rival emperors, Septimus Severus and Clodius Albinus, agreed to rule simultaneously, even though they both saw each other as a threat. Rome's political climate was in absolute turmoil, and soon the rest of the world started to notice. Many of Rome's provinces had been semi-autonomous for a long time, and had developed their own unique cultures. As the central Roman state spiraled, they began to wonder, why not just make our independence official? As Rome cycled through a series of weak, crazy, and forgettable emperors, territories started to break away at an alarming rate. First came the self-declared Gallic Empire, which took most of modern-day France and England with it. Then came the Pomeranian Empire, led by the formidable Queen Zenobia, which took over Egypt and the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. This was the biggest crisis in Rome's history, but it would also trigger massive changes. A series of 3 powerful emperors in the 3rd century would bring this crisis to an end. But the Roman Empire that emerged would be forever changed. First was Aurelian. He only reigned for 5 years, but his impact was huge. At the time, the Roman military was under attack from barbarian tribes and weakened by internal strife. It seemed like the end was near, but Aurelian was a military man who had risen through the ranks. He knew how to fight. Under his command, he fended off the attacking tribes and reconquered both the Pomeranian and Gallic empires. He surrounded Rome with mighty walls, abandoned provinces that were too much trouble to keep, and revitalized the economy. In his short tenure, Rome started to look like its old self again. His successors built on his work. Diocletian, another military veteran, reigned for 20 years. With the military situation mostly handled, he focused on improving the empire's stability. He created a system of regional courts to give the empire more control over its far-flung provinces. He even started expanding again. By the end of his 2 decades in power, he did something unprecedented. He became the first Roman emperor to voluntarily abdicate, retiring to his palace. But his successor would have an even bigger impact. The 31-year reign of Constantine the Great was one of the most successful in the empire's history. He introduced a new currency, expanded the empire's territory, and reorganized the army to be more effective. But his most significant change was his conversion to Christianity, supposedly after seeing a vision of a cross in the sky. As the emperor converted, so did many citizens of Rome. This was the spark that ignited Christianity's rise from a persecuted sect to a dominant world religion. At the end of Emperor Constantine's reign, the Roman Empire was at its peak. It stretched all the way from Britain to the edges of Byzantium. When he died, he left the empire to his sons, kicking off a new dynasty. To many, it looked like Rome was entering a new golden age. So, how did it all go so terribly wrong? The year was 337 CE. Constantine the Great passed away, and while his rule seemed like a string of endless victories, trouble was brewing just beneath the surface. His decision to embrace Christianity gave the church immense power, and not everyone was happy about it. He executed his enemies and handed their estates to his favorites. The military was paid well, but corruption was rampant. Still, Rome was the undisputed superpower of the world. It was hard to imagine anyone posing a real threat. But no empire is immune to internal conflict. After Constantine's death, the throne was up for grabs once again. His sons were supposed to rule together, but this arrangement quickly dissolved into chaos, plunging Rome into a brutal civil war. Ambitious local leaders seized territory, and borders shifted with every military victory. Despite the turmoil, the core of the empire remained strong. By the year 379, a new emperor had emerged from the chaos, Theodosius. He was a proven general, one of Rome's greatest military minds, and he put a swift end to the internal strife. But a far greater threat was gathering beyond Rome's borders. It's hard to believe that a no-magic people from a distant continent could bring the mighty empire to its knees, but the Huns were no ordinary nomads. They were fierce warriors, carving a path of destruction through Asia and Eastern Europe, and wherever they went, people fled in terror. This mass migration pushed the local Gothic tribes right up against the Roman Empire's doorstep. Suddenly, Rome was facing a massive influx of barbarian warriors seeking refuge. This is where Rome's poor management of its border states came back to bite them. A well-organized government might have resettled these newcomers, even integrated them into the Roman military. Instead, corrupt local officials chose to exploit them. Underestimating the threat they posed, they were about to be proven very, very wrong. Rome now had a large, disgruntled population of foreign warriors within its own borders. These so-called guests had seen Roman hospitality at its worst, and they quickly took up arms. They were joined by other tribes pouring over the border, and what started as a refugee crisis spiraled into a full-blown guerrilla war. Rome's military was technically superior, but it was spread thin and concentrated in the cities. The forces sent to confront the Goths discovered these invaders fought with a ferocity they hadn't expected. The Roman elite, safe behind their city walls, felt little of this crisis. But out in the vast countryside, the Goths rapidly gained ground, claiming land across the Balkans. Emperor Theodosius, it seems, might have neglected this problem for a bit too long. He had restored some of Rome's military might, but the imperial treasury was still hurting after decades of his predecessor's lavish spending. He raised taxes to fund the war against the barbarians, which only triggered rebellions from his own people. He also doubled down on Constantine's Christian policies, cracking down on other faiths and even persecuting different sects of Christianity. Soon, he was fighting new rebellions in the West. A rebel leader named Magnus Maximus declared himself emperor in 383 and seized the territory of Gaul. This led to significant losses of land and troops until Maximus made a fatal mistake. He tried to take Rome itself, was defeated in 388, and the empire was, for a moment, whole again. Rome was once more the greatest power on the planet. But this fragile peace wouldn't last. In the year 395 CE, Theodosius died. He left behind a weakened army and no clear successor. His two sons both claimed the empire, but neither was a capable leader. Their ministers were the ones really running the show. Rather than endure another bloody civil war, the two halves of the empire simply went their separate ways. One son, Arcadius, took the Eastern Roman Empire, which would later become the Byzantine Empire. The other son, Honorius, took the western part, including the city of Rome itself. This was the biggest loss of territory Rome had ever suffered, and this time, there was no coming back. The Byzantine Empire, based in the mighty city of Constantinople, would survive for another 1,000 years, but it would never again be the world-defining power that the original Roman Empire was. As for the Western Roman Empire, it still controlled much of Europe, but its days were numbered. Without the vast resources of the Eastern territories, dealing with the massive barbarian invasions became nearly impossible, and the leader of the Huns, the infamous Attila, one of the most feared military commanders in history, now set his sights squarely on Rome. What followed was a death by 1,000 cuts. For the next 80 years, the Western Roman Empire was battered by brutal attacks from the Huns on its fringes, and plagued by the rebellious Gothic population within. The once mighty Roman military was a shadow of its former self, constantly in retreat. The empire's territory shrank piece by piece. Rome started to look less like a global superpower and more like a city in terminal decline. A few strong leaders managed to temporarily restore the military, but none could reclaim the lost territories. The empire limped along until 476, when one ambitious king decided it was time to strike the final blow. His name was Odoacer, a figure often forgotten by history, but one of its most important. The last emperor of Rome, Romulus Augustulus, had a grand name, but was just a 16-year-old boy when Odoacer invaded. Surprisingly, the barbarian king treated the young emperor kindly as he sacked Rome. He accepted his surrender and allowed the boy to live. He sent him away to live with relatives, even gave him a pension, before declaring himself the new ruler of Italy. It was probably the most dramatic firing from a first job any teenager has ever experienced. And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was over. Or was it? It depends on how you define it. Odoacer now ruled what was left, but he was seen as a foreign occupier. The Roman Senate refused to recognize his legitimacy. Instead, they transferred the seal of Roman authority to the Eastern Empire in Constantinople. And so, the greatest empire in history passed into the realm of legend. Did the Roman Empire really fall? Well, yes and no. The government, the emperors, the legions, they were gone. But its most powerful institution was just getting started, the Roman Catholic Church. In the 5th century, the church was still young, less than 500 years old. But its faith had already spread like wildfire and was about to put down deep roots across Europe. As the church grew, so did its power. For the next 1,000 years, it became the de facto government for much of the continent. Even kings answered to the Pope. Few dared to challenge his authority until Henry VIII decided to start his own religion just so he could get a divorce. So while the political Roman Empire was no more, the legacy of the church it fostered would far outlive it. But let's get back to the big question. Why did the empire actually fall? There's no single answer, but a perfect storm of factors. And one of the biggest was the total collapse of its legendary military. Rome's army was once the most powerful force on the planet, attracting the best soldiers with great pay and benefits. But as the empire's treasury dwindled, it struggled to recruit new troops. To fill the ranks, emperors started hiring foreign mercenaries. These soldiers for hire often lacked the skill, and more importantly, the loyalty of the old legions. Many of them even came from the very invading armies they were supposed to be fighting. Unsurprisingly, the military's effectiveness plummeted. To compensate for the lack of quality troops, emperors just threw more money at the problem, consistently overspending on the military. But that didn't fix the core issues. In fact, it just made things worse. The sheer size of the empire created a massive communication problem. Imagine trying to run a continent-spanning operation with no email, no Slack, no Teams groups. Important orders and policy changes could take weeks or even months to reach the frontiers. As the empire kept expanding, this logistical nightmare only got bigger. Eventually, Rome was forced to focus on just protecting its key cities, effectively abandoning huge swathes of its own territory. And while things were falling apart on the borders, the situation back in Rome itself was a complete disaster. A huge problem in the late empire was the shocking lack of stable leadership. You'd think being the Roman emperor was a dream job, right? Unlimited power, untold riches. Well, it came with some serious occupational hazards. At one point, between the 2nd and 3rd centuries, over 20 men held the title in less than 75 years. And the most common reason for leaving the job, a knife between the ribs. Turns out Julius Caesar was a real trendsetter. When an emperor did manage to hold on to power for a few years, they often treated the empire like their personal piggy bank, appointing their cronies to powerful positions. And then there were the emperor's own bodyguards, the Praetorian Guard. They frequently took matters into their own hands, assassinating emperors they deemed more trouble than they were worth. With a government this chaotic and corrupt, is it any wonder the empire began to crumble from the inside out? All these factors are weak military, logistical nightmares, and a revolving door of corrupt or assassinated leaders created a perfect storm. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been militarily unchallenged. Their legions could sweep into a new territory and conquer it with relative ease. But this long period of peace had an unintended consequence. The army's role shifted from a conquering force to more of an enforcement arm of the government, building infrastructure and keeping the peace. They simply weren't prepared for a major military conflict anymore. So, when outsiders like the Goths, who were themselves pushed out of their lands by the Huns, came knocking on the empire's door, the Roman military was no longer the formidable force it once was. They couldn't effectively defend their borders, and it all came down to one fatal series of Mistakes! If the military had been well prepared, they could have likely defeated the Goth armies. They still had better training and superior weapons. But once the Goths managed to cross into the empire, getting them out would require a massive, coordinated effort. Instead of a clear strategy, the Romans chose the worst possible option. They didn't aggressively repel the invaders and secure their borders, but they also didn't welcome them, integrate them, and take advantage of the new manpower. Instead, they exploited the Goths, hiring them as cheap mercenaries while treating them terribly, ensuring they never developed any loyalty to Rome. This led to constant civil wars, skirmishes, and a slow, painful loss of territory, a slow bleed that the empire couldn't stop. And it all could have been avoided if Rome had just managed a better, more humane, and more strategic response when the Goths first sought refuge within its borders. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into Roman history interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.